He said it like it was business. No emotion, no hesitation, and she wasn't supposed to hear it. But she did, on Christmas morning, before the fireplace was even lit. Welcome back to Mr. Charles Stories, where every tale leaves more than a memory. It leaves a mirror. If you've ever wondered what you would do after hearing the person you love plan your exit, stay with us. Because this isn't just betrayal, it's clarity, and Celine Varelli walked into hers too early. Have you ever walked into a truth you weren't meant to hear? Let's begin. The snow hadn't stopped falling since midnight. It blanketed the trees, weighed on the hedges, and turned the Granton estate into a postcard of silent luxury. The kind of morning that demanded slow jazz, cinnamon coffee, and two people unwrapping gifts they actually meant. But it was 7:13 a.m., and Celine Varelli wasn't supposed to be there. She was expected at noon. That was the plan. The usual arrival time, after breakfast with her Aunt Etta, after her walk by the pier, after. She had applied a little makeup and smiled at her own reflection until she believed it. But this year, something pulled her. Something quiet and strong. She needed to see him early. Before the chefs started their routine, before the assistants set the table, before Calder put on his practiced charm. She stepped into the warmth of the mansion, velvet coat still dusted with snow, boots wet, her cheeks pink from the wind. No one saw her. Not yet. The butler, Jansen, was crouched near the fireplace in the drawing room, lighting the kindling with delicate fingers. He hadn't heard her come in. The room was hushed, still cold. Candles flickered along the mahogany banisters. A string quartet's soft rehearsal floated from a distant room. The entire house was dressed in perfection. And then she heard Calder's voice. Not laughter, not Merry Christmas. A clipped, low voice. Phone to his ear. The kind of voice he used in boardrooms. I'm handling it, Ansel. She still doesn't know. The transfer's finalized. The offshore account is clean. After New Year's, I'll file. It'll be clean, quick, painless. Celine stopped breathing. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. But how could she not? Her fingers loosened from her purse. Her coat slipped from one shoulder. Clean, quick, painless. She didn't blink. Didn't interrupt. Didn't ask questions. There was nothing to say. He wasn't just leaving her. He had already started. Without telling her. Without warning. The man she married had made his decision in private and was executing it with precision. Like a deal. Like a project. He had rewritten her out of his future. Quietly. She turned without a word. Slipped back out into the snow, opened the door of her black sedan and sat inside, keys in her hand, but not starting the engine. She stared at the windshield. Snow piled up, wipers stiffened, breath fogged the windows. And she sat, not broken but stunned. The betrayal didn't scream, it whispered. Not the affair, not a lie, not a slap. A plan, executed without her, to remove her. Celine thought back to their first Christmas. They were in Aspen. She wore socks with reindeer on them. Calder was awkward with gifts. He gave her an antique brooch she'd never wear. But he tried. They burned the turkey, made pancakes instead. She had laughed so hard, her cheeks hurt. That was before the jet, before the fourth building in Midtown, before the silence. Now, Calder curated everything, from his suits to their dinners to their arguments, and clearly, to her exit. Later that morning, Celine stood in her apartment, quiet, neat, her reflection in the glass unbothered by mascara or grief. She opened a drawer in her writing desk and pulled out a cream envelope. Inside was the letter. She had written it weeks ago, not because she expected this exact moment, but because something in her had already mourned it. You forgot to love me out loud. You chose silence where I needed presence. I gave you my years. You returned them folded. Alongside the letter, she placed a small silver key. The one to their lake cabin, the place they once dreamed of retiring, of painting walls together, of watching snow fall without pressure to entertain anyone. That dream didn't die today. It had died slowly, quietly, in ignored texts. in rescheduled dinners. In every time, he reached for his phone before her hand. She sealed the envelope, pressed her initials on the wax, and placed it in a plain box. No ribbon, no tag. She didn't cry. She packed. Nothing. No luggage, no jewelry, not even a photo frame. Celine took only her coat, her wallet, and her self-worth. And for the first time in 5 years, she closed the door on that house without wondering what Calder would think. She left the box on the entryway table. That was the last thing she'd ever leave for Calder, a letter he wouldn't expect and a key he no longer deserved. Celine stepped into the elevator and pressed the button with the kind of certainty she hadn't felt in years. She didn't look back, not at the penthouse, not at the memories, not even at the ring she still hadn't taken off. Some goodbyes didn't need an audience. The doorman opened the glass door for her without a word. He offered a small nod. Celine returned it. Even he knew something had shifted. She walked down West 66th, her boots soft against the slush, her hands tucked into her pockets. Everything in the city was decorated, storefronts glowing gold and red, children pressing their noses to glass for toys their parents might not afford, taxi horns muffled by snowfall. Her phone buzzed once. She didn't check it. She already knew who it was. Calder would notice her absence before brunch. He would assume traffic, then errands. Then she'd walk in with her familiar, polite smile and everything would look normal. That was the story he had grown used to, a wife who made no noise. But Celine was done keeping things smooth. She caught the next train and transferred twice before arriving at a street she hadn't walked in over 8 years. Her aunt's brownstone was smaller than she remembered, but the porch, still, had the same creaking swing and the front door the same chipped paint. She knocked once. Then again, Etta opened the door with flour on her cheek, eyebrows raised. "It's not noon." Celine didn't answer with words. She stepped forward and hugged her. It was the kind of hug that carried weight. Etta felt it. She wrapped both arms around her niece and held her for a full minute before speaking. "Whatever happened, you're still standing, and you're welcome here for as long as you need." They didn't talk about Calder, not right away. They made tea, cleaned up powdered sugar, and set out 3 plates, out of habit, before Etta quietly removed the third. Celine caught it and smiled faintly. That was her, always preparing for someone else's place at the table, even when he was erasing her from his. That evening, Celine sat near the window, legs curled under her, watching neighborhood kids throw snowballs under string lights. The simplicity of it tugged at something she'd buried, a part of her that hadn't wanted the penthouse or the gala dresses. She had wanted partnership, someone to laugh with while folding laundry, someone who didn't need the world's approval to come home early. She had spent 5 years adapting her silence to match Calder's. But silence shouldn't be a language in marriage. And now, in the stillness of her aunt's house, the truth rang louder than any argument ever could. Etta sat beside her, slipping her a cup of mint tea. "You don't have to explain anything tonight, but tomorrow you start again. And this time, make sure it's for you." Celine nodded. She slept in the guest room that night, the same one she used to stay in when her parents died and holidays became something Etta tried her best to fill. The sheets were clean, the lamp warm, and there was a book on the nightstand with a bookmark tucked halfway through. It was the first time in months she'd fallen asleep without earplugs, noise machines, or exhaustion from pretending. When she woke, it was still snowing. Her phone had 3 missed calls and a message. Calder. She deleted the call log before reading it. He didn't deserve her panic. Not today. Celine stood by the bathroom mirror, brushing her hair. She hadn't worn makeup in 2 days. Her skin was clearer, her eyes softer. There was no one to impress, and for the first time in years, she liked that feeling. Downstairs, Etta was already making breakfast. The smell of roasted tomatoes and toast filled the space. "I told you. You sleep in here. You eat well." Celine chuckled. "I should have come sooner." Etta glanced over. "But you came. And that's what matters." They ate together, slowly, as if time wasn't something to conquer. No texts to answer. No schedules, just quiet joy. Later, Celine stood outside the little bookstore 3 blocks away. It had a small "For Lease" sign in the window. She stepped inside. Dusty, dark, but filled with potential. The owner said he was moving to Arizona. The space came with an upstairs studio. She didn't need more time to think. She signed interest papers that afternoon. By the following week, she moved in with 3 boxes, a sketchpad, and no plans to explain herself to anyone. The space upstairs was small, a bed, a table, and 1 large window overlooking the avenue. But it was hers. No staff, no cold dinners, no silence pretending to be peace. She rearranged furniture by herself, hung art she liked, played jazz, and never muted her speakers. When it snowed again, she opened the window and let the air in. Her healing didn't need anyone's approval. The pain was still there. Of course it was. You don't share years with someone and walk away untouched. But the grief didn't define her anymore. It lived in a separate room, present, but no longer in control. 2 weeks after moving in, she received a package. No return address. Inside was a thick envelope with a typed note, from one builder to another. "I hope this helps you build again." It was a check. Large enough to pay off the studio's first year and renovate the bookstore. She didn't have to guess. Calder had always used money to fix what his words couldn't. Celine didn't tear it up. She deposited it, but she didn't call him. Forgiveness wasn't always loud either. Have you ever overheard something that shattered the story you thought you were living? What would you do if the person you trusted the most started removing you from their life? Quietly, strategically, without a word. Tell us in the comments, would you confront them or walk away like Celine did? If stories like this make you reflect, feel, or think deeper, like this video, share it with someone you trust, and subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories for more narratives that don't just entertain, they teach. The first time Calder told Celine he loved her, they were sitting in a construction trailer. In upstate New York, both covered in sawdust and arguing over flooring choices. He had been blunt, without ceremony or softness. "You drive me insane," he'd said, "but I love you." She had smiled then, her fingers still holding a measuring tape, not sure if it was the most romantic declaration or the most honest one. Maybe both. They were different then. Messy, hungry, still building. The empire wasn't real yet, just blueprints and unpaid invoices and long nights eating takeout on site. Back then, Calder reached for her like she was part of the plan. Now, she wasn't sure if she'd ever been part of the long-term blueprint, or just part of the construction phase. In those early days, Calder would kiss her without warning, sometimes mid-sentence. He'd cancel meetings to walk with her, even if it was raining. But something shifted as his power grew. His ambition swelled into something impersonal, calculated, measured. He still loved, but it came with timelines and contracts. Celine remembered the first time he left for a 2-day business trip and stayed gone for 8. No call, just a clipped text that read, "Running over, don't wait up." She had waited anyway, staring at a half-eaten plate of pasta, her fingers curled around her phone. When he came back, he kissed her forehead and said, "Sorry, love, the Tokyo pitch got complicated." That was the first time she felt the distance, not in words, but in the air. It was heavier, like something had stepped between them and refused to leave. Then came the shift in their home life. Celine, once part of every major renovation, now found out about changes through Calder's assistant. She didn't mind being left out of decisions until she realized she was being phased out of importance. Dinners became quiet, then became skipped. Their conversations shrank to status reports. Good mornings, good nights, nothing in between. She told herself it was temporary, a growth phase, the stress of expansion. But the weeks passed, and then months. Then holidays filled with strangers in tuxedos and women asking her what foundation she used while Calder drank bourbon and whispered things that made Leora blush. Celine was not naive. She saw everything, the touches that lasted a beat too long, the exchanged glances during meetings, the fact that Leora always seemed to know Calder's schedule before she did. Still, she didn't speak. Not because she was weak, but because she knew Calder. He responded to pressure with silence. Confrontation was useless. He'd either shut down or shut her out. So she observed, carefully, patiently. One afternoon, she visited Calder's office unannounced. It was his birthday. She carried a homemade lemon cake. He wasn't in his office. She left it on his desk. As she turned to leave, she heard laughter down the hall. Leora's voice. Calder's deeper, amused reply. She stepped back. Didn't walk toward the sound. Didn't interrupt. Just listened long enough to hear Leora say, "She still thinks birthdays matter. That's sweet." That night, Celine threw the leftover cake into the trash. She didn't cry, but she did call Etta. They spoke for 2 hours. Etta didn't ask questions, just said, "It's okay to outgrow what once felt right." Celine thought about those words often, especially in the weeks after that call, especially after the Christmas invitation came not from Calder, but from his assistant, via group calendar. The final crack didn't come in a fight. It came at a dinner table. 3 weeks before Christmas, Celine and Calder sat across from each other at home. A rare night in. She had cooked roast chicken, his favorite. He complimented it, told her about a new development in Chicago, talked numbers, taxes, zoning permits. She asked, "Do you even know what I'm working on?" He paused. "Celine, this isn't the time." "It never is." He blinked, then looked back at his plate. "You said you were doing that project, the city park thing." She nodded once. "It's a veterans shelter for women. We broke ground 2 months ago." He said nothing. She got up, washed her hands, packed the leftovers without offering him any. That night, they slept facing opposite walls. What Calder never noticed was that Celine had started to prepare for her exit then. Quietly, with grace, she pulled her name from joint accounts, not out of malice, out of caution. She redirected her architecture payments to a separate savings. She visited a lawyer, not to file, but to understand, to protect herself from the part of him that treated endings like logistics. Celine didn't want revenge. She wanted preservation. She told no one, not even Etta. She needed to move in silence too, to understand how he operated when no one was watching. And Calder, in his blindness, gave her space to do it. He had stopped checking in months ago. His absence gave her room to reclaim herself. In her drawings, in late-night walks, in small things, like singing while folding laundry again. She didn't expect the final moment to come on Christmas morning. But when it did, it felt less like betrayal and more like confirmation. She had always known Calder was slipping away. She had just been waiting for him to admit it. When she heard him say those words, clean, quick, painless, it wasn't a wound. It was a closed door, one she would never reopen. In the present, sitting in her new studio, Celine reviewed blueprints for a community reading center in Harlem. She wore a grey sweater, hair tied in a loose knot, glasses perched on her head. Her phone buzzed again. Calder. She didn't answer. She opened her sketchpad and drew a new entryway for the shelter. Wide, open, warm. A space people would walk into and feel welcome. The kind of feeling she hadn't had in her own home for years. The more she created, the more she healed. Not because art fixed everything, but because purpose did. And for the first time in years, Celine's life had room for purpose again. The first week of January passed in soft rhythms. Celine woke before the sun, walked to the corner cafe, and returned. To her studio with a coffee she no longer bought with Calder's card. She designed structures meant to hold healing, libraries, wellness centers, co-ops, spaces that did what her marriage never did, offer room for people to be heard. She rarely checked her phone. The missed calls came in waves. Calder's number, Ansel once. Even Leora, though she never left a message. Celine refused to pick up. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she wasn't ready to listen. Not until she could do it, without folding into herself. Sometimes she wondered if Calder even knew how much damage he had done. Not through infidelity, that was never confirmed, but through indifference, through the quiet, unannounced decision to leave without having the integrity to say goodbye first. He had made her invisible before he made her single, and that was a different kind of cruelty. One night, while reviewing final measurements for the Harlem Shelter Project, Celine paused. Her hand hovered over her pencil. The blueprint was flawless, but something didn't feel finished. She closed her sketchpad and stared out the window. It wasn't the drawing. It was the ache, the lingering ache of being discarded without conversation, not knowing why she was no longer enough, not knowing when her presence became inconvenient. She had asked herself more than once if maybe she had done something wrong. Maybe she became too boring, too focused on purpose instead of status. Maybe she lost her sparkle somewhere between real estate banquets and pretending the jokes from Calder's friends didn't sting. But the truth was simpler. She was always enough. She had simply become inconvenient to a man who no longer valued presence over performance. Etta called that evening. "You sound better," she said, after a minute of silence. "I feel still," Celine replied. "Still is good," her aunt said. "Still means you're back in your own rhythm." Celine smiled. She hadn't thought of it that way. They talked about nothing in particular. Tomatoes in the garden, a recipe for walnut bread, a neighborhood kid who built a snow penguin instead of a snowman. Celine laughed more during that call than she had in months. After hanging up, she lit a candle and sat by the window. It was snowing again, thick and soft, the kind of snowfall that made cities quieter, slower. Her phone vibrated. One new voicemail. She ignored it, let it play out. But something about the silence after the notification, the weight of it, made her curious. She pressed play. Calder's voice filled the room, low and tired. "You weren't supposed to hear that." He paused. "I had to transfer the land into a separate account. The oil company discovered reserves on your father's land last quarter. If your name stayed on the trust, you'd be liable for every contract and tax burden. I wanted to fix it without scaring you. I thought I could protect you. I thought I was doing something good." Another pause. "I know how that sounded, and I know what I broke, but it was never about someone else. There's never been anyone else. I just handled it wrong. Like I always do." Celine sat motionless. Her breath slowed. She replayed the beginning of the message, just the first sentence, then stopped it. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Of course it wasn't what it sounded like. Of course he had reasons. But the reasons didn't undo the method. She had been planning her emotional exit because of his silence, and now she was being asked to reevaluate all of it, not because he begged her to, but because now she knew something that changed the frame, not the picture. The next morning she put on a beige coat and caught the 9 a.m. train to Midtown. The cafe was quiet, tucked between a dry cleaner and a florist. She picked the farthest table by the window and ordered black coffee with honey. At 9:27, Calder walked in. He looked older, not in his face, but in his posture, like the last few weeks had pulled something out of him. He wore a dark coat, no tie. His eyes scanned the room and landed on her. He walked over slowly, almost uncertainly. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. Celine nodded. She didn't offer a smile, but she didn't shut down either. He sat. They stared at each other for a moment. "You look well," he said. "I am," she answered. Another pause. He folded his hands on the table. "I won't repeat the voicemail. I just needed to say it to your face." She waited. "I was trying to protect you," he said again. "From liability, from stress. You always hated business mess." "You made me part of your empire," she replied, "then erased me from the cleanup." He winced. "I didn't erase you. You didn't talk to me. I didn't want to scare you. You didn't want to need me." That landed hard. He looked down. "You're right." Celine studied him. The man she had built years with. The man who once pressed his forehead to hers after the Chicago approval came in. The man who kissed her wrist before every trip. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had grown used to control and forgot that love requires presence, not just protection. I needed to be a partner, Calder, not a bystander. I know, he said softly. And I needed you to love me where I could see it, not just where it looked strategic. He closed his eyes for a moment. I'm sorry. She nodded. I believe you. A long silence settled between them. I'm not asking for anything, he added. Not forgiveness, not a return. I just didn't want the last thing you heard from me to be that. Celine took a breath. Thank you for saying that. They didn't hug, didn't cry, didn't linger. When they stood, Calder reached into his coat pocket and handed her a second envelope, smaller than before. She opened it after he left. Inside was a transfer slip, legal ownership of her father's land, signed back to her, free and clear. There was also a sticky note. You were never folded. You were the foundation. She stared at those words for a long time. They didn't erase the past, but they didn't hurt either. That night, she opened her sketchpad again and began drawing an addition to the Harlem. Shelter, a small room in the back, circular, warm, meant for quiet reflection. Sometimes, the heart needed places to sit alone with itself, not in sadness, but in clarity. Celine no longer needed closure. She had found understanding, and that was enough. The sky over the city was a dull grey the morning Celine mailed the signed acknowledgement back to Calder's legal office. She didn't write a note, didn't attach a thank you. The gesture had already been received. She had no desire to start a back and forth of polite guilt or sentimental pull. She didn't want to be part of a slow apology. What she needed now was movement, forward. Celine walked 3 blocks to the post office and dropped the envelope in the internal slot. When it slid out of her hand, it felt like a chapter sealed, not with anger, not with regret, but with quiet knowing. She had loved a man who didn't know how to share his world without controlling it, and she had tried to love him into softness, into openness, into clarity, but she was not a sculptor. She was not meant to carve someone into who they should be. She was meant to build, and Calder's walls were never built for two. She left the post office and wandered into a small fabric shop nearby. It had nothing to do with work. She just liked the feel of cotton and wool between her fingers. She picked out a deep burgundy swatch and tucked it in her coat pocket. Later, she'd make a new throw pillow for her reading chair. It was a small joy, and she had learned the value of small joys. They added up faster than grand apologies. That evening, Celine sat on the floor of her studio, sorting through old portfolios. Not the projects she had worked on in the last year, but the ones from her 20s. Her internship sketches, community housing ideas, a safe walkway built under a freeway overpass, designs that weren't driven by prestige, but by people. She remembered how full she used to feel then. Before everything became a reflection of someone else's success, Calder had never discouraged her work, not directly, but he had nudged it into his world, his buildings, his contacts, his image. Over time, Celine realized her designs were no longer hers. They were pieces of a curated empire, branded, stylized, expensive. She traced her finger over one old sketch, a public reading corner made of recycled wood and glass, a structure that invited light in but kept weather out, a place children could escape into stories, even when home wasn't safe. That was the Celine she missed, the Celine who designed for warmth, not applause. The next day, she reopened a project proposal she had pushed aside for months, a free art studio in an underserved neighborhood on the south end of the city. She'd pitched it a year ago, but after Calder's team passed on the sponsorship, she let it go. Quietly, out of habit, out of exhaustion. Now, she was bringing it back. This time, on her own terms. She contacted a local youth shelter director and asked for a meeting. He was surprised to hear from her. Most people made promises, he said. Few returned. She said, I'm not most people. The meeting took place in a building that smelled like floor polish and forgotten Christmas decorations. But the energy in the room was alive. A teenage girl named Tammy, showed Celine a wall they wanted to turn into a mural. Another kid, Jermaine, suggested a rooftop garden. Celine smiled as she took notes. This was what she had missed. Not just designing for people, designing with them. She left that day with a new sketchpad, a list of requested features, and an ache in her hand from taking real notes. It felt good. Back at her studio, she started drawing immediately, not on the computer, by hand, late into the night, with music playing low and her windows fogged from the heater. The lines came back easily. Her instincts hadn't left. They had just gone quiet for a while, like she had. Days passed like that. She declined 2 interviews and ignored 3 invitations to events she once felt obligated to attend. People whispered. Some reached out of curiosity, others out of gossip. Celine didn't respond to any of them. She was too busy living. One morning, she received a package without a return address. She opened it to find a single item. A book, worn, leather-bound. Inside the front cover, a sticky note in Calder's handwriting. You once said you didn't need big gestures, only honesty. I found this on your old bookshelf. It was The Giving Tree. She hadn't seen that copy in years. Not since their first apartment. She held it for a moment, then placed it on her nightstand. She didn't message him, didn't return it. It wasn't an invitation to reconnect. It was an acknowledgement, and that was enough. Sometimes, people apologized not with words, but with effort. Sometimes, effort didn't need to be received. It only needed to be recognized. Celine continued her work with the youth center, met with planners, walked empty lots with teens in borrowed coats pointing out where benches should go. She documented everything, not for social media, not for praise, for the community's archive. She wanted them to remember that this space was built with their fingerprints. Weeks later, she was asked to speak on a local podcast about emotional resilience and starting over. She almost said no. Then she remembered the young girl who had asked her at the shelter. How do you keep your voice calm, even when everything goes wrong? So she agreed. The interview was short, honest. She didn't talk about Calder. She talked about silence, and how it eats away at love faster than time. She talked about how letting go isn't weakness, it's direction. She talked about how protecting your peace may look selfish, but is the most generous act you can give yourself. That episode went viral within 2 days. Her inbox filled with messages from women, from men, from people in the middle of quiet divorces, from single mothers trying to rebuild, from college students choosing majors their parents disapproved of, from retirees trying to find purpose again. Celine replied to every message with one sentence: "You're not broken. You're building." One day, she came home to find a small box sitting on the stairs outside her studio. No name, no note. Inside, a piece of the lake cabin's original stone fireplace. She held it in her hands, turned it once, then placed it on her desk beside a candle. It didn't hurt. It just was. She understood Calder now, fully, and he, finally, understood her. But that didn't mean they belonged in the same future. It meant they had finally closed the door properly, not slammed, not left ajar, just closed. And in that space, Celine began designing something new, not for others, not for love, but for herself. Celine didn't tell Etta about the podcast right away, not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to keep it hers for a little while longer. It wasn't fame, and it wasn't exposure. It was healing. That kind of quiet recognition from strangers, from people who had only heard her voice, and understood the spaces between her words, that was more intimate than applause. When she finally mentioned it over tea the following Sunday, Etta blinked. Once, then twice, and smiled in that unbothered way she always had. "Took them long enough to start listening," she said. Celine laughed, full and real. Etta sipped her drink and added, "You've always been worth hearing. You just finally decided to speak somewhere you were free." They didn't talk about Calder. They didn't need to. By now, Celine had come to terms with what they were and what they weren't. She could see his apology in the small, steady actions, the unsigned checks, the restored land deed, the returned childhood book, the stone from their old fireplace. But the gestures came too late to undo what silence had hardened. They had once loved each other, truly. That wasn't the question. But love wasn't enough without effort, and effort without presence was just performance. She had loved him in his becoming. He had loved her in his safety. But when she needed him to show up, he disappeared into management mode, making moves, not memories. She didn't need more gifts. She needed her own reflection to stop shrinking. And now, for the first time in years, it wasn't shrinking anymore. The youth shelter project moved fast, not because there was money, there wasn't, but because there was energy. People cared. Volunteers came with paintbrushes and coffee. Teenagers showed up to meetings and offered their ideas without apology. Celine met with local donors, not executives in glass towers, but barbershop owners, pastors, community nurses, people who passed around a clipboard instead of a checkbook. One afternoon, Jermaine, the high schooler who'd once joked about putting a skate ramp on the roof, asked Celine what she used to do. "I designed corporate buildings," she said. He looked confused. "Like offices?" "Yes." "That sounds sad." Celine didn't correct him. She just smiled and nodded. "It was..." He grinned. "You're cooler now." It was the highest praise she'd received in years. That night, she found herself sketching again. Not for work, not for a pitch, just for fun. She drew a reading corner with oversized pillows, a built-in window seat, and shelves low enough for toddlers to reach. She imagined murals painted by neighborhood kids, quotes on the walls, blank space for dreams. The next day, she presented it to the committee. They approved it without edits. A week later, she found herself standing in front of a local grant board, pitching the project as if it were her first. Not because she was unsure, but because she was present, passionate, alive in a way she hadn't felt since before Calder, or maybe since before she started shrinking to fit into his world. After her presentation, one of the board members, an older woman with sharp eyes and a floral scarf, leaned forward and asked, "What made you leave the corporate world?" Celine didn't flinch. "I got tired of designing beautiful buildings for people who didn't need them," she said. "Now I build safe places for people who do." The room was quiet. Then came the soft sound of pens signing approval. They gave her the grant. No applause, no handshake, just quiet support. And it meant everything. That night, Celine walked home through streets dusted with early March snow. Not enough to settle, just enough to shimmer beneath the streetlights. Her breath rose in clouds. Her coat was zipped high. She paused at the corner, watching cars glide through the intersection, and allowed herself a moment to feel proud. Not because someone said she was extraordinary, but because she finally believed she was enough. Her phone buzzed. A single message. Calder. No greeting. Just a line. "I saw your interview. I hope you know I'm proud of you." She stared at it for a long time, then deleted it. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. Some chapters close with full stops, others with silence. She didn't need his pride. She had her own. 2 days later, Etta dropped by the studio with lemon muffins and a file folder. "What's this?" Celine asked, wiping flour dust off the cover. Etta gave her that raised eyebrow look. "Your mother's journals. I told you I'd pass them on when you were ready." Celine hesitated. "I'm not sure I am." "You are," Etta said, "or you wouldn't have come this far." That night, Celine lit a candle, curled up in her reading chair, and opened the first page. Her mother's handwriting was neat, slightly slanted. The first entry was dated 2 months before Celine was born. "I don't know what kind of world I'm bringing her into, but I want her to grow up knowing that silence is not peace, and that choosing herself doesn't make her unkind. It makes her whole." Celine didn't cry. She just kept reading. And when she reached the last page, she folded the journal closed and whispered, "I hear you now." She looked around her studio, the space she had rebuilt, the life she had reclaimed. She wasn't the same woman who once waited at a cold dining table, wondering why the man she loved had started treating her like a problem to manage. She was someone else now, whole, present, quiet in the right ways, loud in the ones that mattered. That weekend, the community held a celebration for the youth shelter's new wing. There were streamers, homemade cookies, a dance circle where toddlers spun in oversized coats. Jermaine stood next to her, arms crossed, trying not to smile. "You should say something," he muttered. "I already did," she said. He looked confused. She gestured to the building. "This is my thank you." He didn't say anything after that. He didn't need to. Because they both understood, some statements are made in steel beams and open doors, in windows that let light in exits that leave dignity intact, in returns that never happen because they're not supposed to. That night, Celine sat in her studio, flipping through her mother's journal again, then picked up her sketchpad. On a blank page, she wrote one sentence before sketching, "Build only what loves people back." And then she drew, and kept drawing, because some women survive heartbreak. Others use it to draw blueprints that change their corner of the world, forever. The first time someone called Celine director, she didn't respond right away. The word floated down the hallway of the newly opened shelter, like it had belonged to someone else. She had been standing with her sleeves rolled up, adjusting the alignment of the youth mural when the name echoed again. "Director Celine?" "The supply van is outside." It took her a second, then she smiled, not for show, not out of pride, but out of recognition. This was her world now, not borrowed, not managed for someone else. This one had her name quietly stitched into the walls. She stepped outside to greet the delivery driver. He handed her a clipboard and asked, "This your place?" She nodded. "Mine and theirs." He looked up at the painted sign above the entrance. The Haven. Simple, warm. A name chosen by the teenagers who helped build it. He grinned. "Feels like it." Celine signed for the boxes and helped carry in the last crate of donated books. It was snowing lightly again. New York snow, soft at first, then biting by mid-afternoon. She didn't mind. The cold kept things real. It reminded her that beauty could also carry weight. Inside the multi-purpose room, 2 young girls were decorating the reading corner. The beanbags had just arrived, deep green, rust orange, and pale grey. The shelves were low and half-filled already. There was a small donation plaque by the window. It read, "To those who needed a place before they had a voice." Celine didn't write it. Jermaine did. She'd seen him scribbling on a napkin weeks ago. When she asked what it was, he just said, "Something real." She walked through the rooms quietly, checking light bulbs, noting where paint needed a second coat. But mostly, she watched. Kids were filling the space, not with noise, with energy, with laughter in corners, with drawings taped to walls without permission, with music played too loud in one room and too soft in another. She didn't tell them to stop. She didn't correct anyone. They were home here, maybe for the first time in a long time. Later that afternoon, she stepped out for tea. Her usual corner cafe was crowded, so she slipped into a small shop 2 blocks further down. Inside, it was quiet. Wooden booths, a soft jazz playlist looping in the background. She ordered chamomile and sat near the window. As she waited, someone walked in behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know. Calder. He hesitated at the entrance, then spotted her. She caught his reflection in the glass. He looked different now. Not just older, grounded in a way he hadn't been before. Or maybe she was the one who'd changed. Maybe she was finally seeing him without the filter of longing. He didn't come to her table right away. He ordered his drink, black coffee always, and then walked over. "May I?" he asked. She nodded once. He sat, hands wrapped around his cup. Neither of them rushed to speak. Finally he said, "I came to drop off something at the shelter. I didn't know you'd be nearby." Celine nodded. "You could have left it with the front desk." "I could have," he agreed. Another pause. He pulled a small envelope from his coat and slid it across the table. Inside was a single photo, a snapshot of the cabin in winter, its roof dusted with snow, the lake beyond it frozen. No people. Just the house, still standing. "I'm letting it go," he said quietly. Thought you should know. She didn't respond. He continued. It was never about the property. It was what we put into it, and what we left behind. Celine stared at the image. She remembered that cabin, the weekend they first bought it. Painting the porch rails, fighting over the right stain color, falling asleep to crickets. It was supposed to be their retreat. Instead, it became a placeholder for something that never arrived. You're doing good work, he added. I read about it. The library, the mural project, the shelter. Celine looked out the window. Snowflakes hit the glass softly, disappearing before they could stick. It's not about doing good, she said. It's about doing something that doesn't erase people. He nodded slowly. I'm trying to learn that. You could have learned it while we were married. He looked down. I know. There was no malice in her tone. No sharpness. Only truth. I used to think love would wait, Calder said. That if someone really mattered, they'd still be there when I was ready to show up. Celine looked at him. Love doesn't wait forever. It notices when it's been alone too long. He nodded again. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, a child slipped on the sidewalk and burst into laughter. A parent caught their arm before they fell again. Small joy. Quick care. The kind of presence Calder had never mastered. He sipped his coffee. I'm not here to rewrite anything, he said. I know I can't. I just wanted to see if, maybe, we could have something. Even if it's not what it was. Celine looked him in the eye. Not with anger, with clarity. I don't want what it was, and I don't need what it could have been. Calder took a breath. Sat back. She continued. I've forgiven you, truly, but that doesn't mean I want you in my future. His shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in understanding. Okay, he said. Thank you for saying that. They didn't say much after that. He left a few minutes later, didn't ask for her number again, didn't suggest dinner. He walked out with the same silence he had once used to hurt her. But this time, it didn't sting, because this time she had chosen the silence. Back in her studio, Celine pinned the photo of the cabin to her corkboard, not as a memento, but as a reminder that some things survive, even when you leave them behind. She turned to her desk and opened a new file, a letter of intent to start a mentorship program through the shelter. She'd call it Blueprints, not for buildings, for people, teenagers, young women, survivors, anyone learning to build again after being broken quietly. She began typing, one sentence at a time, every word its own foundation, because this was her life now, no longer waiting to be chosen, no longer shrinking for comfort, no longer managing a narrative that erased her. Now, she built stories, in walls, in hearts, and every structure said the same thing, you belong here. The next week moved in quiet motion. Celine filed paperwork to register Blueprints as a pilot mentorship program, and scheduled the first group session for the following month. The youth shelter provided the space, a small upstairs room with a skylight, 2 cracked windows and mismatched chairs. She didn't care. It had light, and that was enough to begin. She printed flyers on recycled paper and posted them around local cafes, community centers, and school front desks. She didn't use her name on the flyer, just the program, just the vision. A space for rebuilding what the world tried to erase. 3 days later, she received an email from a high school counselor downtown. 5 girls had signed up. 2 of them were struggling with anxiety. 1 had recently aged out of foster care. The others were tired of trying to be invisible just to survive. Celine stared at the message for a while. She didn't reply right away. She didn't want to respond out of formality. She wanted to show up the right way, with presence, not polish. That Friday, she sat with her notes and outlined the first session. No icebreakers, no tell us your dreams exercises. Just honesty. What does safety look like for you? What made you stop speaking up? Who made you feel like you had to earn your right to stay? The questions weren't designed for answers. They were designed to open windows. The following week, she arrived early, set out tea and notebooks, lit 1 lavender candle near the door. She sat in the back, not at the front. She wanted them to feel like she was beside them, not above them. When the girls arrived, they walked in hesitantly. Some made eye contact. Others didn't. One girl, maybe 15, asked, "Is this therapy?" "No," Celine said gently. "This is us." The session was quiet at first. Some scribbled. Others stared at the window. No one shared right away. Until one of them, Soraya, looked up and said, "I hate mirrors." Celine didn't ask why. She waited. Soraya kept talking. "Because they tell the truth. And most of the time, I don't like what I see." No one spoke. Then another girl, June, said, "I hate silence. It means I have to hear myself think." And just like that, the room opened. Not fully, not all at once, but enough for air to move again. Celine didn't lecture. She didn't guide. She listened, asked once, "What do you need today?" and then let them carry the rest. After the session, they helped stack chairs. No one rushed out. Some lingered. 2 asked if they could come back next week. Celine nodded, smiled, and said, "This room is yours." Back at her studio that night, she sat in front of her open window, a soft breeze lifting the edge of the curtain. She didn't play music, didn't read. She just sat, letting the silence feel full instead of empty. Her phone buzzed. Ansel. She hadn't heard from Calder's lawyer, or friend, since the message from Calder weeks ago. She debated answering, then did. "Celine," Ansel said, voice low and deliberate. "He asked me not to call you again, but I thought you should know. He's stepping down from 3 of his boards, selling the company's stake in the Midtown project. He says it's time for something else." Celine didn't respond. "I think," Ansel continued, "he's starting to understand that building more towers won't fix what he didn't nurture." She let the silence stretch. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "He won't bother you again," Ansel added. "He meant it when he said goodbye." "I believe him." They hung up without further conversation. Celine sat still, not because she was sad, but because peace like this didn't come often. That night, she opened her mother's journal again. Page 76. A note written on a summer afternoon years ago. "Grief is not always about what you lost. Sometimes it's about what you had to give up to keep your self-respect." She closed the book and breathed deeply. She understood that now, fully. The next day she walked the perimeter of the new mural wall behind the shelter. The paint was chipped in places. A few corners needed smoothing out. She brought 2 volunteers and a bucket of fresh primer. They worked without talking, just music and brushes and light conversation. Jermaine passed by at one point and nodded. "Looks good," he said. She smiled. "Want to add something?" He hesitated, then grabbed a brush and wrote one word in thick black strokes along the bottom edge. "Still." That night, as Celine was locking up, she got an email from a local college professor. She had heard the podcast, read about the shelter, and wanted to invite Celine to speak to students about emotional architecture, designing spaces for healing, not just utility. Celine read the message twice, then closed her laptop and let it sit. She didn't need to answer right away. She'd speak only when she had the energy, because her voice was no longer on demand. It was hers. The following week, her second mentorship session was packed. 2 boys joined. One had been kicked out of 3 schools. The other carried a notebook but never spoke. Soraya brought a poem. She read it without looking up. It wasn't polished, it wasn't loud, but it cracked something open in everyone who heard it. After the session, one of the new boys stopped Celine at the door. He asked, "Why are you doing this?" She thought about it, then said, "Because I wish someone had done it for me." He nodded once, then walked off. That night, Celine sketched something new, not a building, a program, a timeline, a 12-month model. She was ready to make blueprints bigger. A woman from the grant board had once asked her, "What made you leave the corporate world?" Now she had a better answer. Because this world, the one she was in now, didn't need skyscrapers. It needed structure. And she was finally strong enough to provide that, not just in buildings, but in boundaries, in rooms that held truth, in conversations that didn't center wealth or power or illusion, but people. She wrote her proposal draft in one sitting, submitted it that same night, not to prove anything, but because she was ready to build a new foundation, one that could hold more than just herself. And it would begin here, in quiet rooms, with real names, and no more silence. The proposal for blueprints was approved in 10 days, faster than Celine anticipated. The foundation director called her personally, complimenting the clarity of her vision and the way her program focused on healing before performance. Most people try to fix the outside first, she'd said. You're choosing to strengthen the inside. Celine thanked her, hung up, and sat for a while in her studio. She didn't smile. She didn't dance. She just stared at the open window and let the wind fill the space. It wasn't that she wasn't proud. She was. But the moment felt too sacred for celebration. This wasn't just a win. It was an anchor. A confirmation that all the pieces she had once lost, her voice, her confidence, her direction, were now working in quiet rhythm. She texted Etta, "It's official." Etta responded a minute later, "You were always meant to lead. You just stopped asking permission." That night, Celine met with the original group of teens from the shelter. Soraya, Jermaine, June, 2 new girls and 1 boy who barely spoke. She shared the news with them, and their reaction surprised her. They didn't cheer. They didn't ask, "What's next?" They sat up straighter, as if they now understood the room they were sitting in was part of something bigger. "I'm not leaving," Celine assured them. "Blueprints is growing, but this space stays. You helped build it." Soraya raised her hand. "Does this mean other people will have rooms like this?" Celine nodded. "That's the plan." Jermaine leaned back in his chair. "So we started something." "You did," she said. "You started it. I'm just helping it move forward." They stayed longer that day. Even after the session ended, they moved tables, replaced batteries in wall clocks, cleaned the windows. They weren't helping. They were claiming. The following weekend, Celine was invited to speak at the college. It wasn't a keynote, just a seminar discussion. She wore a grey blouse and black flats. No blazer. She didn't bring slides. She didn't prepare a script. She arrived with a notebook and a cup of coffee and stood in front of 30 students who didn't know her story, just her mission. She started with a question: "What do you want a building to do, other than stand?" The room was quiet. Then someone said, "Protect." Another added, "Inspire." A third, "Breathe." Celine nodded. Good answers. Now replace the word building with person. There it was, the pause that let the lesson land. She spent the next 40 minutes walking them through emotional architecture, designing lives that could hold truth. How some people wear steel beams, all structure, no softness. How others are made of glass, see-through and breakable. She explained how healing was not about erasing the past, but about reinforcing the parts that were still standing. She didn't mention Calder, not by name, not by implication, but she talked about silence, about what it does when left too long, about how peace doesn't mean the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. After the seminar, 3 students waited to speak to her. One asked for reading material. Another asked if she'd ever open a program for college-aged youth. The last, a young man with nervous hands, said, "Thank you. I didn't know someone could describe what I felt without knowing me." Celine placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're not hard to know. You've just been spoken over too long." He blinked once, then nodded. That's it. When she returned to the studio that evening, there was a package waiting. No note. Just a plain white box with her name written neatly in block letters. Inside, an old photo of her and Calder, taken years ago at a public park opening. She was laughing, her head tilted slightly, eyes closed. He was standing beside her, not looking at the camera but at her. There was a quietness in his gaze. Not pride, not ownership, something else. Curiosity. Beneath the photo was a short letter. Celine. This was always my favorite photo of us. Not because we looked perfect, but because I didn't know you were pulling away yet. You looked free, and I didn't realize that somewhere along the line I'd built a cage and called it a home. You don't have to respond. I just wanted to return something that was never mine to keep. See, she stared at the letter for a long time, then folded it, placed it in a drawer, and left the photo out on her desk. She didn't keep it for nostalgia. She kept it to remind herself that even when she was giving away her best, her light had still belonged to her. That weekend, she visited the lake cabin one last time. Not to stay, just to see. It had officially been signed over to a new family, a couple with 2 boys. They had already painted the porch and added new shutters. Celine stood at the edge of the property and looked at the water. It was still, completely frozen over. The trees were bare, but proud. Nothing was blooming, but everything was standing. She smiled, then turned and walked back to her car. Some places don't need revisiting, just a final nod, a thank you, a quiet goodbye. Driving back, she passed an old diner she and Calder used to stop at. On a whim, she pulled over and stepped inside. The bell above the door rang. A waitress greeted her with a tired smile. Celine sat in a booth by the window and ordered a grilled cheese and tomato soup. Something simple, familiar. As she ate, she overheard a couple arguing 2 booths down. Not shouting, just talking through tension. "I'm not trying to hurt you," the man said. "I just don't always know how to do this." The woman replied, "Then say that instead of saying nothing." Celine stirred her soup, eyes soft. That was the difference, wasn't it? Not the failure, but the silence, the refusal to share the weight until the other person collapsed. After paying, Celine left a tip and scribbled something on the receipt before walking out. Tell her what you feel, not what you fixed. That night, back in her studio, she sat at her desk and reviewed the growing interest in blueprints. 4 new cities, 2 donor offers, a tentative request for curriculum support in public schools. She didn't rush to accept any of it. She knew what urgency could do. It could take something sacred and turn it into another machine. She would grow it slowly, with presence, with hands, with heart, and when she was ready, she'd bring on others to help. People who understood that healing wasn't loud, that some stories didn't end with fireworks or closure speeches. They ended quietly, like snow falling, like someone finally walking away from a room that no longer echoed. That night, Celine added a new quote to the bottom of her mirror. Not for affirmation, but for direction. You are allowed to rebuild without the blueprint they gave you. And she did, every day, brick by brick, voice by voice, with no need to ask again, am I enough? Because now, she answered herself. The days grew longer, and the city thawed. The bitter edge of winter softened, and sunlight returned in longer stretches across the windows of Celine's studio. She no longer flinched when her phone buzzed. She didn't fear voices from the past. Her life had outgrown the old version of herself, and even the old versions of what she thought love had to look like. Blueprints launched its 3rd mentorship group that month. This time, the session included single mothers, recent immigrants, and a woman in her 60s who hadn't spoken to her children in a decade. Celine didn't separate the groups. She let ages blend. Experiences cross over. Everyone had something to give. Everyone had something to receive. One of the younger girls, Leona, shared a journal entry aloud, 3 lines that shifted the room's temperature. My house was quiet, but not because we were happy. We just didn't know what to say that wouldn't make it worse. So I learned to be silent before I learned how to write. No one moved for a full minute. And then one woman, older, with silver braids, reached over and placed her hand on Leona's notebook. Not to take it, just to connect. Celine watched it all, heart steady. She wasn't fixing people. She was giving them a space to breathe. And in return, they were teaching each other how to stay whole. That night, after locking up, she walked 2 blocks down to a local bookstore that had started carrying her recommended reading list. It was something small, a shelf labeled emotional blueprints near the back. She didn't get paid for the curation. She didn't want to. It was part of the community, part of the new life she had chosen to build, brickless but sturdy. She browsed the titles, ran her fingers along spines, picked out one by an author she'd once listened to when she felt hollow after dinner with Calder. It felt like finding an old friend. The clerk at the counter smiled. "You're Celine, right?" Celine raised an eyebrow. "Depends who's asking." The clerk laughed. "I'm Lani. My cousin came to your shelter group last week. Said you don't talk much, but everyone feels better when you do." Celine chuckled softly. "That sounds accurate." Lani nodded. "You're building something good. I can feel it." Celine nodded in return. "So are you. Don't think bookstore jobs don't save people." Lani grinned. "Yeah, I guess. Books don't judge, neither do walls that don't echo," Celine added. They shared a quiet moment, and then Celine left, book in hand, heart full in that low, consistent way she had come to love. Not the rush of romance, not the panic of performance, just the feeling of living aligned. But even peace has its patterns interrupted. 2 days later, she received an invitation, a formal envelope, heavy paper, her name written by hand. Inside, a wedding invite. She hadn't seen the names in over a year, Leora Dane and Mason Yelverton. Mason had been one of Calder's investors. Celine hadn't even known they were a couple. The wedding was scheduled for early summer. Venue, upstate. Guest list, likely filled with people who used to know her as Calder's quiet wife. No personal note, no thought of you, no warning. Just a date, a location, and the polite assumption that she would show up. She didn't feel angry, not exactly, but she felt something shift in her chest. Not pain, not shock, but a slight ache, like touching a bruise that should have healed, but hadn't been tested in a while. She placed the invitation on her desk, didn't respond, didn't throw it away, just let it sit. The next morning, she told Etta over tea. Etta's only response was to raise one eyebrow and ask, "Do you want to go?" Celine stirred her tea. "I don't know." "Then don't decide yet." Celine smirked. "You're not going to tell me what's right." "I never do," Etta said, "because your voice works just fine now." Later that day, she received a message from someone she hadn't expected, Calder. It wasn't long. Just a text, "Did you get it too?" She didn't reply. That evening, while walking back from the shelter, she saw him. Standing by a food truck, paper coffee cup in one hand, collar turned up against the wind. He spotted her just as she saw him. He didn't move toward her, just waited. She walked over slowly, calmly. "Didn't expect to run into you," he said. Celine looked at the truck. "Still drinking that syrup-heavy latte?" "Some habits die hard. Some die easy when you want them to." He nodded, accepting the jab. They stood in silence for a beat. Then Calder spoke. "You got the invitation?" "I did. I don't know why they sent it. Maybe they thought it would seem polite." "Did it?" "No," Celine said simply. "But I'm not offended." Calder looked surprised. "You're not?" "No. But I'm also not interested in going, in pretending it doesn't scratch a place I've already healed." He looked at her then, not regretfully, just with something that resembled acknowledgement. "You look not over it, beyond it." "I am," she said. "And it took a long time." Calder nodded. "I've been working with a grief counselor," he offered. "Not because of you, well, maybe because of everything. She told me silence is usually inherited." Celine studied his face. "That's true," she said, "but keeping it is still a choice." "I made the wrong one," he admitted. She said nothing. He asked, "Would it bother you if I didn't go either?" "It doesn't matter to me what you do anymore, Calder." Not in a bitter way, in a released way. He gave a faint smile. "That's fair." They parted without a goodbye. Not cold, just clean. When Celine returned to her studio, she moved the wedding invitation from her desk to a drawer. Not because she was trying to bury it, because it had nothing left to teach her, and she had work to do. The next morning, she started drafting a framework for a satellite version of blueprints. A partnership with a public library in the Bronx. More reading corners. More warm walls. More programs with no pressure, no timelines, no prerequisites for healing. Just space. Just presence. Just people who would show up for one another when the rest of the world couldn't. And as she worked, a line from Leona's journal returned to her. I learned to be silent before I learned how to write. Celine picked up her pen and wrote beneath that in her own notes. And now we learn how to speak in places where silence once ruled. She pinned it to the wall. No more shrinking. No more waiting. Just building. Have you ever rebuilt your life in silence, only to be reminded of what once broke you? Would you attend a celebration that came from someone else's betrayal, or would you protect your peace? If this chapter made you reflect, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in Celine's shoes? Tap like to support stories that speak truth without noise. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories, where every episode reminds you healing can be quiet, but never small. 3 weeks after the wedding invitation, Celine received another envelope. This one didn't come with scripted fonts or cream linen stock. It was a simple white folder, sent from the office of a Community Advocacy Award Committee. Inside, a letter. Congratulations. You've been selected to receive the Metro Human Dignity Award for your contributions through the Blueprints program and your architectural initiatives for underserved communities. The ceremony would take place at City Hall. Guests optional. Press guaranteed. Celine sat with the letter on her lap for over an hour. She wasn't someone who chased attention. Her work had never been about recognition. But this felt different. Because it wasn't for a design. It wasn't for a skyline. It was for a feeling. A space. A truth she had fought to protect, for herself and for others. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She just exhaled. Later that evening she mentioned it to Etta, who looked up from her knitting and said, "Well, they're not wrong. You've been doing holy work in quiet corners." Celine smiled. "It doesn't feel holy. It feels overdue." Etta's hands paused. That's what holy usually feels like when it's real. In the following days, Celine received more letters, local news features, student emails, requests for interviews. She read each one, grateful but careful. Her name was becoming known, but she didn't want to become a symbol. She wanted to remain human, present, available to the same people she was building for and with. Blueprints expanded again. 2 new facilitators joined her under a trial model. Both had lived experience. One had survived domestic abuse. The other was a former youth counselor. Celine interviewed them in a small cafe with no formal questions. Only 2, what broke you and what helped you not stay broken. Their answers were unpolished, unrehearsed, real. She hired them on the spot. They'd run weekly sessions across 2 new locations, one in Queens, the other in Newark. Celine would still lead her original group. She wouldn't leave what started everything. The night before the award ceremony, she received a message she didn't expect. From Leora. It read, "No expectations. Just wanted to say congratulations. It was always going to be you who did something that mattered." Celine stared at the screen for a while, then turned off her phone. She wasn't angry anymore, but she didn't owe every echo from the past a response. The ceremony was modest but elegant. City Hall's chamber filled with community leaders, program directors, and a few carefully chosen journalists. Celine wore a simple navy dress and a silver pin her mother once gave her, a small star etched in glass. When the announcer read her name, the applause came slowly, then built. She walked up calmly, no nerves, just breath. At the podium, she didn't clear her throat or flip a page. She spoke directly from memory, the same way she spoke to her mentorship groups. "I've spent a long time being quiet. For years, I thought strength meant keeping things inside. That dignity was about staying calm, even when you're disappearing in front of the people who say they love you. I know now that strength isn't silence, and dignity isn't shrinking." She paused, looked up, steady. "I didn't build Blueprints to fix people. I built it because I needed a place where I didn't have to apologize for healing out loud." Another pause. To every woman who stayed too long, every boy who was told to toughen up instead of speak up, every person who thought being silent was the only way to stay loved, you were always more than that silence. A breath, a small smile, and you still are. She stepped back. The applause came again. Not loud, but full. After the ceremony, people approached. A woman from a college in Chicago, a principal from a charter school in Atlanta, a city planner from Boston. They offered admiration, collaborations, admiration again. Celine thanked them, gave her card, and told them she'd think on it. Because she would. Not every opportunity needed to be a yes. Back in her studio that night, Celine placed the award on a low shelf. Not front and center, just present. She didn't want it to be a centerpiece. She wanted it to be a reminder of what it took to get here and who she refused to stop being. The next morning, she went back to the shelter. No cameras, no one watching. Just Soraya and Leona already waiting, curled into their beanbags, laughing about something she couldn't hear from the doorway. She paused before entering. It was the first time in a long while she truly saw the difference between surviving and returning. She was no longer surviving Calder's silence. She was returning to herself. Later that day, while organizing storage bins in the back room, Celine found an old cardboard box labeled wall materials. Inside were unused paint cans, brushes, half-taped stencil sheets, and at the bottom, a folded piece of paper. It was a note. No name, just neat, angular handwriting. This place helped me feel seen. Not fixed, just seen. Thank you for not rushing me. Celine folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. She would keep it with her. That afternoon, while heading home, she walked past a bench near the edge of the park, one Calder had donated years ago. His name was etched on a small metal plate, Royce Group Partners, Urban Renewal Bench number 4. She sat on it, not to remember him, but to claim her own peace, even here, even where his name was carved. A child ran past with a balloon. A man played saxophone 3 benches down. The air was brisk, but she didn't shiver. She sat for 20 minutes, then rose and walked away. Her name wasn't on any plaque, but it was already written in every wall that held someone who once thought they didn't matter. And that would always be enough. Celine spent the rest of the week moving slowly, not from exhaustion, but intention. Her schedule had filled up without her forcing it. Blueprint sessions in the evenings, 2 interviews lined up for non-profit magazines, and a meeting with an architectural student who wanted to shadow her work. She accepted the meetings that felt aligned, declined the ones that were too polished, too eager to feature her name in headlines that weren't grounded in truth. She had learned the difference between being seen and being used. On Thursday afternoon, she returned to the reading room at the Haven. It had grown quieter in recent weeks. Not because it lost interest, but because the kids had found a rhythm. They didn't need constant guidance anymore. They greeted her with nods, not nervous chatter. The room no longer felt like a project. It felt like a community. Leona had started bringing snacks to each session. Jermaine now arrived early to set up chairs. Soraya had submitted a spoken word piece to a local youth competition, and when Celine asked her if she was nervous, she shrugged and said, "I've already performed in a room that mattered. That stage is easy now." Celine smiled and told her, "That's the point." That night, while reviewing sketches for an upcoming safe housing shelter in the Bronx, Celine received an email from a woman she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "I was the secretary who watched you leave quietly." The message was short. "You don't know me, but I worked for Calder the last year you were together. I used to see you come into the office and wait. I remember thinking how composed you looked and how he never quite met your eyes when he came out to greet you. I watched you disappear slowly, and I said nothing. I'm sorry. I also wanted you to know you were always more present than he was. You were the room, even when no one gave you a chair." Celine sat still for a while after reading it. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel triumph. She felt acknowledged. Sometimes it wasn't the people who hurt you that needed to apologize. It was the ones who stood nearby, the ones who now saw the full weight of what they'd ignored. She wrote back 2 sentences. "Thank you for telling me. I hope you speak for yourself now too." That evening she revisited a stack of old journals, the ones she used to write in when the marriage had first begun unraveling, pages filled with confusion, self-blame, attempts to interpret Calder's moods and silences. She used to reread them, trying to find where things shifted, where she failed, where the warmth left. Now, she skimmed one, closed the rest, and set the stack aside for good. Those pages belonged to a version of her who believed she had to fix things alone. That wasn't her anymore. She wasn't chasing clarity. She was living it. The next morning, Celine walked into the first city planning committee meeting for the Bronx shelter. She wore soft blue linen and carried rolled sketches in one hand and a thermos of tea in the other. At the table were community leaders, volunteers, and 2 teenage girls from the youth council who had helped design the vision. One of them, Naya, asked a question mid-presentation. "Do we get to decorate the walls too?" "Yes," Celine said without hesitation. "This is your space as much as anyone else's." They grinned. The city rep took notes. The meeting ended early. Progress was being made, not through pressure or performance, but steady presence. Afterward, one of the teenage girls caught up to Celine in the hallway. "Why do you let us talk so much?" "Other adults don't." Celine thought for a second. "Because you're not quiet, you're just unheard. And I'm not here to fill space. I'm here to share it." The girl smiled. "You should write that down." Celine laughed. "Maybe the first will." That night, she did. She wrote it on a sticky note and posted it on the edge of her bookshelf. "I'm not here to fill space. I'm here to share it." As she moved about her apartment, watering plants and folding laundry, she thought about the quietness of her life now, the absence of tension, the gentleness in her schedule. She remembered how she used to wake up to silence in her penthouse and feel suffocated by it. Now, her mornings were still silent, but free. There were no curated brunches, no strategic public appearances, no needing to wear clothes for events she didn't want to attend. Just a deep breath, sunlight across the studio, and the knowledge that she had a full day of meaning ahead of her. She received one more message before bed. This one from Calder, a single photo, the last building they worked on together, now repurposed into a public education facility. A note followed. "I had no idea how much of your touch stayed in the places I took credit for. I see it now. Thank you for not stopping, even after I did." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Not out of bitterness, but because some closure comes from continuing forward, not returning back. That weekend, she hosted a quiet dinner at Etta's. Just them and a few friends from the shelter. Simple food, worn dishes, stories shared over candlelight. No photographers, no plaques, just legacy. The kind you pass hand to hand, not hand to mic. After dinner, Etta pulled Celine aside and said, "I'm proud of you, not just for what you've done, but for the way you did it. You didn't shout your healing, you built it." Celine smiled. "I learned from the best." Etta hugged her, whispered, "You outgrew the room you were once kept small in, and instead of burning it down, you built others for people who needed them." Celine held on to that, because it was true, and because it reminded her that healing, real healing, isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's sitting at a table with people who see you, eating a meal made from scratch, knowing the walls around you were not designed to trap you, but to hold you. And finally, after so much quiet survival, knowing that your voice never needed to be loud to be heard, it just needed to belong to you. The following Monday, Celine walked into a co-working space in Lower Manhattan. Not sleek like the ones Calder's company rented out, but warm, lived in, with corkboards filled with flyers for free clinics, community poetry nights, and mental health sessions led by retired therapists. She had been invited by a young urban designer named Noam, who followed her blueprints work. He introduced her to a round table of creatives, architects, social workers, tech students, and one former city engineer, who now spent his days teaching engineering principles to inner-city kids using cardboard models. Celine didn't come with an agenda. She came with a notepad and an open mind. She listened. They talked about spatial justice, gentrification, and the power of design to either include or erase people. A woman across the table said, "We don't need more mirrored glass towers. We need corner libraries that don't close at 5. Celine wrote that down too. She left the meeting with 2 new project invitations and a mind humming with ideas. On her way out, Noam asked her if she'd ever considered teaching part-time. Your story has structure, but it also has soul. People need both. She said she'd think about it. At home, she sat on her floor, papers spread around her. Floor plans for 3 community centers, feedback forms from students, letters from women who read her article in Architectural Values Quarterly about reimagining public spaces through empathy. She didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt ready. By the time midnight came, she had written out a proposal draft for an online course titled Spaces That Heal, Designing Beyond Steel and Glass. It was practical, real, honest. She didn't want to teach the theory. She wanted to share what the cold buildings never taught her. On Tuesday, she visited the lake cabin, not because she missed it, but because she needed to close the chapter for herself. Snow still covered the porch. The inside was untouched, quiet, a faint smell of cedar and old ambition. She walked through slowly, touched the frame of the rocking chair she once picked out, stood in the center of the kitchen where she and Calder had once argued over what backsplash to choose, and laughed themselves into a truce. None of it hurt anymore, because she didn't want it back. She opened the drawer by the fireplace. Inside was a photograph, her and Calder at their engagement party. He was laughing. She was looking at him. She almost didn't recognize that version of herself, hopeful, unaware of the kind of silence that would follow. She put the photo back, closed the drawer, and with it, the need to carry it forward. She left the cabin as she found it, intact but no longer hers. On the way back to the city, Celine stopped at Etta's. They sat over bowls of soup, and Etta said, "You don't owe anyone a return. You owe yourself a continuation." Celine nodded. She had learned that love wasn't always about returning to where things fell apart. Sometimes it was about honoring the effort and still choosing the door that led elsewhere. She hadn't told Etta about Calder's message, or the oil, or the trust, or the land, not because she wanted to hide it, because it no longer had power. But Etta noticed the difference in her anyway. "You've stopped carrying things that never asked to be carried," she said gently. Celine smiled. "I'm lighter." 2 days later, she received an unexpected letter. Not an email, a real envelope. From Calder. It wasn't long. "I've read everything I should have listened to. I've remembered everything I tried to rush past. I know now what I distorted in the name of progress. I thought legacy was in headlines. You knew it was in hands and hearts. You were always ahead of me. I don't want to rewrite history. I want to respect it. Thank you for leaving with grace. It taught me more than staying ever could." Celine folded the letter once and placed it in the back of her bookshelf, not because she needed it often, but because some truths deserve to be kept, not as a wound, but as a witness. That Friday, she gave her first Blueprints talk at a high school in Queens. The students didn't know her from her past life. They didn't care about awards or glossy portfolios. They asked real questions. Why did you stop building rich people's buildings? Did it make you sad to walk away from the money? Are you happier now? She answered them plainly. I stopped because I wasn't seen. I walked away with myself intact. That's wealth too. I don't always feel happy, but I feel aligned, and that's deeper. One student raised her hand. How do you know when something is over? Celine paused. When your peace costs more to stay than to leave. The room went quiet, and then someone whispered, "Damn." She laughed softly. Not because the moment was funny, but because she saw her old self in their eyes, hungry for clarity, ready for direction. That night, she got dinner with 2 of the students who had become volunteers. They asked if she ever wanted to fall in love again. She shrugged. "I'm not chasing it, but if it shows up as soft as silence and strong as presence, I won't run from it." They nodded. One of them, A boy with a camera always slung over his shoulder said, "That sounds like a dope line for a spoken word piece." She replied, "You can borrow it." And that was enough. Celine walked home through light snow. No driver, no assistant, just her boots, her scarf, and a peace that came from not needing to be saved or celebrated. She unlocked her studio door, turned on the lamp, and exhaled into her space. She had built a life where truth didn't need volume. It just needed consistency. She belonged to herself. And it showed. 2 weeks after the school talk, Celine received a call from the City Arts Council. A woman named Marisol invited her to be a guest speaker at an upcoming panel on architecture and healing. It would be held at the old Carnegie Library, a building Celine once passed without notice but now found herself gravitating toward. She didn't prepare a speech. She brought stories. And when the day came, she stood in front of artists, planners, survivors, and listeners. No slides, no fancy words. She simply began. I used to believe impact came from scale. The bigger the project, the bigger the mark. But over time, I realized the most life-altering spaces aren't always the ones that impress. They're the ones that hold us. Spaces that know grief. Spaces that don't ask us to perform. Spaces that say, "You belong," even on your worst day. A quiet murmur spread through the room. She continued, "I lost a version of myself inside glass towers. I found her again in shared kitchens, bookstore lofts, and community halls with cracked tile floors. And I learned that love, real love, doesn't need chandeliers. It needs presence. It needs honesty." Afterward, a woman in her 60s with soft grey hair approached Celine with tears in her eyes. "My daughter went through a silent divorce last year. She kept trying to look okay. She follows you on that blueprints thing. You helped her get through." Celine swallowed the emotion rising in her throat and touched the woman's hand. "I'm glad she's still standing." "She is," the woman said, "and now she wants to design shelters." That night, Celine lit a candle in her studio and stared at the soft glow, remembering her aunt's old words. Even in the quiet, there's guidance. A message from Calder buzzed in. She didn't open it immediately. She made soup first, lit a second candle, then read his text. "I've submitted the farmland to the Land Trust Registry. Your name has been cleared of any liability. You're protected. I'll send you the paperwork once it's processed. That's all. Just wanted you to know. No request, no invitation, just facts and care." Celine replied simply, "Thank you for following through. It matters." He responded, "So did your silence. It made me grow up." The next morning, she mailed a check. Not to Calder. To a women's housing initiative in the Bronx she had quietly supported for months. She increased her donation, added a handwritten note, "For warmth that outlives winters." Then she walked to the train. She liked the train. It made her feel connected, human. A girl on the platform recognized her from a podcast interview she'd done weeks ago. "You're the architect who left the Billionaire, right?" Celine gave a small smile. "I'm the architect who remembered herself." The girl nodded with quiet admiration. "That's cooler." They rode 2 stops together, talked about goals, uncertainty, the price of pretending. By the time Celine got off, she felt something she hadn't in months, clarity without heaviness. That evening, she found an envelope slid under her studio door. It was from Etta. Inside was a photo, not from the past, from the now. Celine standing with students in Queens, all laughing, arms raised, imperfect but proud. On the back, Etta wrote, "This is your return. Not to him, to you." Celine pinned the photo on her wall, right above her desk. It stayed there. The next Friday, Calder's assistant sent an email, not about business, about closure. Mr. Royce would like to extend an invitation to a private showing of the new grant-funded exhibit he created in your father's name. The exhibit will feature recovered history of the land's original black farmers in upstate New York. Your attendance is not required, but welcomed. Celine stared at the message for a while. She didn't answer immediately. She walked to the river first, watched couples pass by, parents chasing toddlers, two elderly women walking in matching coats. She stood under a bare tree, its branches reaching up like open hands. Her father's land, his legacy, now tied to something living. That mattered. She replied, "I'll attend, not for a reunion, for recognition." The night of the showing, she wore navy again. Not because it was sad, because it was hers. She walked into the exhibit quietly. No red carpet, no photographers, just the sound of history being honored, voices of farmers on recordings, photos of land deeds reclaimed, names long forgotten now carved in wood. Calder stood by a plaque. He didn't rush to her. He waited until she approached. When their eyes met, there was no hunger, no ache, no regret, just quiet understanding. He gestured gently toward the display. "Your father used to wake before dawn." "I didn't know that. I read it in an interview he gave years ago. He said dawn was the only time the land listened." Celine nodded. "It still does." They stood side by side. No touching, no whispering, just remembering. Calder looked at her. "You rebuilt your life without needing me, and I'm in awe of it." Celine's voice was soft. "You gave me the space. Even if it started as avoidance." He took that in, and didn't argue. They spoke for 10 more minutes. Then she turned to leave. Calder didn't ask to walk her out. He didn't ask to meet again. He only said, "Thank you for not becoming bitter." She replied, "Thank you for not letting power keep you blind." She walked back into the cold. Tighter scarf, steady steps. At home, she poured tea, wrote in her journal, and underlined the same sentence twice. Love isn't proven by staying. It's sometimes proven by how gently we leave. She turned off the lamp, went to bed with peace beside her. Not Calder, not memory, peace. And she slept without waking once. The bookstore below her studio closed for renovations in early March. Celine missed the morning smell of brewed coffee and ink, but the silence gave her room to think. She had begun sketching again. Not for anyone else, for herself. Notebook after notebook filled with concepts, adaptive libraries, shelters, with quiet rooms, schools built with curves instead of corners. She sent one design to a non-profit in Baltimore. No reply yet. That was okay. She wasn't chasing speed anymore. She was chasing soul. One morning, as the light broke over the buildings, Celine pulled a forgotten coat from the back of her closet. Inside the pocket, she found a pressed flower, a single violet Calder had once tucked behind her ear in Aspen. She held it for a while, then set it on the windowsill and kept dressing. Later that week, she visited a small neighborhood art gallery near Bedford. It had a rotating Healing Through Color exhibit, and that month's theme was Shades of Return. In the corner, a canvas stopped her cold. A woman stood in profile, eyes closed, hair swept by wind. Her clothes weren't torn, but they looked lived in. Her hands were empty. Her posture said everything. The plaque read, "Release before rebuild." She stayed in front of it for 10 minutes. The gallery host, a tall man in a corduroy jacket, approached and asked if she was an artist. Celine smiled. "No, but I'm finally learning to live like one." They talked. He introduced himself as Dennis, a retired therapist turned painter. He ran weekend creativity circles in a back room filled with mismatched chairs and paint-stained tables. "Come by," he offered. "No pressure. We just create." The next Saturday, Celine showed up with a notebook and no plan. By the second hour, her hands were covered in charcoal, and her soul felt lighter than it had in months. No one asked about her last name. No one expected her to explain. She returned the following week, and the next. One rainy evening after the circle, Dennis asked if she'd like to lead a session on designing space for emotional repair. She hesitated. He noticed. "You've lived it. You don't need credentials for that." She agreed. The workshop filled quickly. When she spoke, it wasn't from theory. It was from what heartbreak taught her. That design wasn't just about aesthetics or function. It was about restoration, making spaces that held grief, gave room for breath, and whispered that people were safe to start again. After the session, a young man named Theo approached her. He was soft-spoken, mid-20s, working through the loss of his sister and his own past as a foster kid. He said, "I didn't know I needed permission to create something soft. I thought survival only had edges." Celine touched his shoulder. "Edges are how we protect. Softness is how we remember we're human." That line stuck with him. A week later, Theo emailed her a sketch, a community greenhouse built from reclaimed glass. She cried, looking at it. Not because of the design, because someone trusted her with their healing. Late one night in April, Celine received a letter from Calder's sister, Isla. It was handwritten, elegant, no return address. Inside was a single page. "Celine, I don't know if I'm overstepping, but I needed you to know what you were to him before the silence. Before he became so tangled in expectation, you softened my brother in ways I never could. I watched him go hard again when you left, but I also watched him learn. It's not mine to say what should happen now, only that, thank you for loving him before he even knew how to love himself, with care. Isla." Celine read it once, then again, then folded it, slid it into her journal, and lit a candle. She wasn't sad. She was grateful, not for the pain, but for the insight that came after it. The following Monday, the non-profit in Baltimore called. They wanted to fund her design. The library she had sketched in February would be their pilot site, a space for teenagers who had aged out of foster care, offering books, mentorship, and a sense of home. The budget wasn't grand. The meaning was. Celine said yes before the call ended. She worked for 3 months on that project, every line in the blueprint drawn with purpose. She designed reading nooks that felt like hugs, staircases wide enough for group chats, and windows that welcomed morning sun like a familiar voice. She visited the site twice during construction, once during a rainstorm where the builders were drinking cocoa under a tarp and arguing about ceiling angles. It made her smile. Real buildings, real people, real life. On the soft opening day, one of the teens who would live upstairs and help run the library approached her. A girl named Tasha, 16, fierce eyes, guarded smile. "You really used to be married to that billionaire on the Forbes under 40 list." Celine chuckled softly. "Yes, and you left." "I returned," Celine corrected. "To myself." Tasha nodded slowly. "Cool, I want to do that too. Like, make something that feels like mine." "You will," Celine said. "Start with what hurts. That's where the gold hides." Tasha grinned. They planted lavender by the entrance together, and for the first time in over a year, Celine didn't flinch when her hand brushed someone else's too long. It wasn't romance. It was presence, and she was ready for it. Calder wasn't on her mind much anymore. Not daily, at least. Not in the aching way he used to be. He appeared in moments, like a song lyric that reminded her of a shared drive to Maine, or the way she now stirred her tea without realizing she mirrored his clockwise habit. But Celine didn't resent those moments. She observed them, then let them pass. Healing, she'd learned, wasn't about scrubbing pain clean. It was about letting life sit beside it and choosing joy anyway. In early June, a board member from the New York Community Renewal Project called. They had heard about her Baltimore design and wanted to meet. Celine agreed, but insisted on coffee instead of a formal pitch. They met at a cafe tucked under a bookstore in Tribeca, one with stained leather chairs and lopsided pastries. The man, Marcus Keene, was sharp-eyed but warm, mid-50s, wore mismatched socks. "We're thinking of converting 5 abandoned firehouses into co-creative community spaces," he said. "Art, healing, storytelling, places where people can feel again. I don't want corporate design. I want soul. You're the only name that keeps coming up." Celine blinked. She hadn't chased this. She had created with quiet hands. But someone noticed. Marcus leaned forward. "You up for it?" She nodded. "Yes. But only if the people who live there co-design the spaces." He smiled. "That's exactly why you're the one." That night, Celine walked home slower. not to drag time, but to feel it. Summer air brushed her collarbone. A violinist played on the corner. A little girl held her mother's hand and skipped. For the first time in a long time, Celine felt full. Not loud, not dazzling, just full. She climbed the stairs to her studio, tossed her keys into the ceramic bowl Etta made years ago, and checked her voicemail. There was one new message. It was colder. Again, she stared at the phone, then pressed play. Celine, I'm in Tokyo tonight. It's late. The city's quiet. And I realized, I don't remember what you sound like when you sleep. That used to be my favorite sound. I'm not calling to pull you back. I know what I did. I know how clean I tried to make my choices. I forgot that love needs to be messy, present, loud. I'm sorry I forgot that. Wherever you are, I hope you're creating, that you're safe, that someone makes you laugh with their whole face, that you never settle for silence again. There was a long pause before the click. Celine sat on the edge of her bed. No tears came. She felt sadness and grace. He had finally said what she'd waited years to hear, and he said it without expecting anything back. She wrote his number on a sticky note, then deleted the message. Closure didn't need applause. It just needed truth. A week later, Celine hosted her first summer session at one of the converted firehouses. The theme, what didn't break you, built you. Dozens came. Widows, teen fathers, former inmates, displaced artists, retired nurses. They didn't ask about her title. They asked about space, color, light. How do we make this feel like home? One man asked. You don't decorate pain, she replied. You hold it, and you let the room breathe until it exhales. Everyone was quiet. Then someone started clapping, and they all joined in. In the corner of that firehouse, a woman named Jory painted a mural of two hands, one reaching, one steady. Celine added a small line beneath it. Come as you are. Stay until you remember who you've always been. After the session, she returned to her studio to find a package at her door. No return label. Inside, a small wooden frame. Inside the frame, a pressed violet. No note. But she knew, and she smiled. Not because she wanted the past back, but because the past had finally honored the love that once lived inside it. She lit a candle, set the violet on her windowsill, and whispered something only the room needed to hear. Then, she opened her design journal and drew a new space. One without walls, one without labels, a room for people to enter broken and leave blooming. Because that's what she had become. A woman who walked in on Christmas morning and heard her life quietly ending, and who chose, without fanfare, to write a beginning no one saw coming. The calendar shifted again. Late July pressed against New York's shoulders, hot and wide, and the city throbbed with rhythm. Horns, heat, sidewalk chatter, and above it all, Celine's studio stayed still. Her mornings followed a pattern now. Stretch, tea, letters. Letters not sent to anyone, just written. Each morning, she chose a different version of herself to write to. The girl who wore her mother's pearls on her wedding day. The wife who made cinnamon pancakes waiting for Calder to come home. The woman who once cried on a dressing room floor over a size tag. Dear me, you were never too much. They were just too quiet. She didn't cry much anymore. Not because she was healed completely, but because her grief had rhythm now. It didn't knock her over. It sat beside her, quieter, known. On a Tuesday afternoon, Etta came over with a brown paper bag full of tomatoes and basil. I got tired of pretending the market's tomatoes were better than mine, Etta said, wiping her brow. Let's eat honest food. Celine laughed. You always say that because it's true. And truth fills you up better than lies ever will. They cooked barefoot in the tiny kitchen, stirring without recipe, laughing without filter. Etta hummed. Celine chopped. You ever talk to him? Etta asked after a long pause. Celine shook her head. He left a voicemail. I listened. That was enough. Closure. Grace. Etta tilted her head. You know, not all women get that. Some spend years wondering why. I did too, Celine said softly. But now I know the why doesn't fix the how. That night, after Etta left, Celine stood on her rooftop. No music, no distractions, just the skyline stretching like open arms. And for the first time, she said it out loud, I don't need to be chosen again. It wasn't anger, it wasn't bitterness. It was fact. She had loved honestly. She had lost quietly. And she had rebuilt with her own hands. Across the city, Calder watched a different skyline from a different height. A sleek suite in Tokyo, glass walls, a tray of untouched sushi. His assistant had left hours ago. His phone sat beside him, unread. The offshore account had been cleared, the trust restructured. Everything he once tried to handle behind closed doors was now exposed, in spreadsheets and lawyers' emails. But what haunted him wasn't the numbers. It was the silence. Not hers. His. He had loved Celine. Deeply, stupidly, quietly. And that was the failure. Not the financial secrecy, not the offshore account, but the silence he let grow between them. The dinners he skipped, the late-night glances he never held long enough, the moments he let pass, thinking she would always understand. She had, until she couldn't anymore. He had learned something in those empty months. Women like Celine didn't leave loudly. They left completely. And when they did, no amount of regret could bring them back. He didn't chase her again, not because he didn't want to, but because chasing now would be selfish. She was healing. He could hear it in her silence. Back in the studio, Celine drafted a new design for a women's shelter in Queens. The request had come from a survivors group. They wanted warmth, color, dignity, no grey walls, the email said. We've lived in enough grey. Celine smiled as she sketched. A splash of terracotta, a wall of affirmations in 20 different languages, a pantry with a chalkboard that read, take what you need, leave what you can. She thought of her own emotional pantry, what she took, what she gave, what she left behind. She wrote a note at the top of her draft. Healing isn't fancy. It's familiar. The project launched 2 weeks later. No press, no ribbon cutting, just 32 women and their children walking into a space that finally felt like breath. One woman pulled Celine aside. You designed this? Yes. You ever lose everything? Celine didn't blink. I once mistook silence for love, but I found my voice. The woman nodded. Then you get it. Celine didn't build shelters now. She built beginnings, places for people who needed to start again without apology. That night, alone in her studio, Celine lit a candle. Not for grief, for gratitude. Not everything healed loud. Some things healed fully. And in her quiet, Celine heard it, her own voice. Finally, louder than anyone else's, Celine woke at dawn the next morning. No alarm, just calm. She tied her robe, padded across the old wooden floors of the studio, and brewed her tea in silence. Outside, a gentle rain tapped the windows like a rhythm only she could hear. The city didn't need to know how much she'd changed. She did. Across the room, the letter from months ago still sat on her desk. The one she left for Calder, the one that had closed a chapter without war. She read it once more, not to feel pain, but to remember her growth. You forgot to love me out loud. The words no longer stung. Now they served as proof of who she was, what she endured, and what she would never accept again. By mid-morning, Celine met Mariah, a young woman from the shelter, for a design consult. Mariah had saved for months to open a small shop, plants, wellness items, and handmade journals. She wanted help making the space feel sacred. Celine stepped into the bare shop with no judgment, only vision. You want it to feel like breath, Celine said. Mariah looked surprised. How did you know? Because I once needed that too. They spent hours laughing over mismatched fabric swatches and old mason jars they planned to repurpose as lighting. Mariah paused at one point and said, You talk like someone who's lived 2 lives. Celine smiled. 3, maybe. By the end of the day, they'd mapped out a store full of sunlight, lavender, and shelves that curved like a hug. When Celine left, she felt something lift, the kind of purpose that came not from recognition, but quiet impact. A few days later, Celine visited Etta again. They walked through the community garden Etta helped start, baskets in hand. "You seem lighter," Etta noted. "I'm building again. But for others this time. Not to prove anything, not to impress anyone." Etta touched her shoulder gently. "That's the difference between power and peace." They sat under the old oak tree, sipping lemonade, sharing old photos. One picture showed Celine at 25, in her wedding dress, radiant, hopeful, quietly unsure. "Would you warn her if you could?" Etta asked. "No," Celine answered. "I'd just stand beside her longer." She was brave to believe. That evening, Calder sent one final email. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a proposal. It was clarity, subject, final words. "Celine, I won't ask for a response. I needed to tell you I admire who you've become. What I failed to understand, you honored anyway. What I handled with spreadsheets, you handled with grace. You didn't deserve the silence. You deserved applause. If there's one lesson I carry, it's that power without presence is hollow. Thank you for teaching me, even when I failed to listen. Be well." Calder. Celine stared at the message for a long time. Then she closed the laptop. She didn't cry. She didn't reply. She simply whispered to herself, "I already am well." A month later, she stood before a small crowd at a new community center ribbon cutting. Press-free, quiet, safe. She thanked the women who trusted her designs. She spoke about dignity, space, and the unseen strength of starting over. Afterward, a little girl tugged at her dress and said, "Are you famous?" Celine knelt. "Only to people who see me." The girl grinned. "I see you." Celine hugged her, heart full. Later that night, back in her studio, she journaled one last time under the heading, Final Reflection. Love isn't the wedding. It's not the matching pajamas or the photo ops. Love is presence. Love is noticing. Love is loud in its own quiet way. I won't ever ask someone to choose me again. I will be the choice I live with proudly. As she blew out the candle beside her bed, a breeze came through the open window. She didn't know where it came from, but it felt like freedom. Rain softened into mist the next morning. Celine opened her windows wide, letting the chill in. No music played, no screen buzzed. She just stood barefoot on the old wood floors, watching New York stretch into a grey-blue blur of buildings and breath. She didn't miss the penthouse. She missed nothing that once demanded her silence. There was something sacred about making toast in a small kitchen, about washing your own mug, about choosing your own sheets and leaving the curtains open without worrying about skyline aesthetics. There was a knock at the door around noon. Not loud, not hesitant, just a knock. She opened it to find a young boy, maybe 12, holding a package. "You, Celine." "I am." He handed it over. "Guy downstairs said to bring this up." She smiled and tipped him with the only cash she had, a 5 and a mint from her coat pocket. The boy laughed and ran off. Inside the package was a photo frame. No note, just a black and white image inside, taken years ago at the lake cabin. Celine and Calder sitting on the edge of the dock. She was laughing. His eyes were on her, not the camera. He wasn't performing. He was present. She traced the glass lightly with her finger, then turned it over. Carved into the wood was a single line. "I see you now." Celine didn't reach for her phone. She didn't text or call. She set the frame on the shelf beside a candle and a vase of wildflowers from the market. Some acknowledgements don't need replies. Later that day, she met with a group of women who had survived financial abuse. Women rebuilding lives from bank statements, eviction notices, and courtrooms. Celine was their design consultant, but more than that, she was their listener. One woman, Patrice, said, "I used to think love was letting him take care of everything. Now I see he was taking everything." Another, Gemma, added, "I used to believe the quieter I was, the safer I'd be." Celine listened, then said softly, We confuse silence with safety, but love is loud when it's real. It doesn't hide behind bank accounts or calendar invites. It shows up. A few women cried. One asked, "How did you survive?" "I didn't," Celine said. "I restarted." That night, she stopped by Etta's once more. They baked orange scones. Etta danced around the kitchen in her slippers, teasing Celine for being too neat with the icing. Midway through sipping tea, Etta said, "You know what I've noticed?" "What?" "You don't mention Calder anymore, not even in passing." Celine stirred her tea and smiled. "That's because he's no longer part of the sentences I build." Etta nodded. "That's healing." Celine knew it was. Not bitterness, not repression. Just distance, measured and earned. She left that night with a small box Etta insisted she take. Inside were letters from her mother. Celine had never seen them. "I found these after the fire at the old house. Saved them, in case one day you needed to remember she loved you," Etta said. Back at her studio, Celine opened the first letter. Her mother's handwriting was soft, slanted, full of warmth. "My darling Celine, if life ever quiets too much, sing. If love forgets how to speak, listen anyway. You come from strength, not sorrow. Don't let silence steal your spirit." Celine didn't cry. She inhaled deeply and whispered, "I hear you now." She tucked the letter into her journal. Outside, the city lights blinked like stars closer to Earth. The woman who once lived in curated perfection now lived in chosen simplicity. No mansion, no staff, no PR, just meaning. Calder didn't call again. Not after the photo, not after her silence. He must have understood, or finally respected the boundary. Celine kept moving. Winter began to melt into the soft promise of spring. The bookstore beneath her apartment started leaving fresh tulips at the entrance. The air held less bite, more possibility. She had meetings, proposals, site visits, but she also had quiet mornings. She journaled. She read. She gave herself what she used to give to everyone else, attention. One Thursday, she stood in front of the mirror in a small dressing room at a community center downtown. They were hosting a panel, and the director asked her to share her story, not just her career, but her personal truth. She stared at her reflection, not the makeup, not the dress, the woman, her, and she whispered aloud, "You're allowed to take up space." That night, she stood on stage with 6 other women. They spoke of grief, of false success, of shame wrapped in wealth. When it was her turn, Celine didn't prepare a speech. She stepped forward and said, "When I walked in on Christmas morning, I overheard my husband planning to remove me from our shared life, quietly, legally, strategically. And the part that broke me wasn't that he wanted to leave, it was that he already had. He just hadn't told me. I want you to hear this. You are not dramatic for needing presence. You are not greedy for wanting partnership. You are not selfish for walking away from almost love. There are people who will manage your life with spreadsheets and signatures. But love, real love, shows up. I don't hate him. I don't regret loving him. But I remember myself now. And I promise you, once you remember who you were before the silence, you won't ever let anyone erase you again." The crowd stood, not clapping politely, but fully, emotionally, as if something cracked open in them too. Backstage, a young woman hugged her. "I didn't even know I was settling until tonight," she whispered. "Thank you for saying it out loud." Celine held her close and replied, "Now that you know, you won't go back." Later, alone in her apartment, Celine lit a single candle. No noise, no audience. She wrote in her journal, "Closure doesn't need doors slammed. Sometimes it's just a window opening." She closed the book and placed it beside her bed. The next morning, she visited her father's land. Not with Calder, not with a lawyer, just herself. The trees were taller. The soil still smelled like summer storms. She walked the property lines, memories whispering beneath her boots. Her father's old barn was still standing. Barely. She sat inside for hours, dust catching in the light, warmth from the sun breaking through a cracked pane. She remembered helping him plant seeds. He'd said, "You water what matters, Celine. You don't just hope it grows, you show up." She finally understood. Calder had tried to protect the land, but without presence, protection became control. She chose presence now, and she had herself. Months passed. Celine started a foundation, the Out Loud Project, a place for women who'd been erased, in high-powered marriages, who wanted to reclaim identity, career, and voice. She wasn't a poster child. She was proof. She was walking, breathing clarity. One crisp morning in May, Celine walked to the coffee shop. The barista smiled, handed her a drink without her saying a word. "I saw your panel last month," she said. "My mom cried." Celine blinked. "Thank you. No, thank you. I'm learning what kind of woman I want to be." Celine stepped into the sunshine, coffee in hand, and paused at the corner. Life wasn't loud, but it was full. She didn't need Calder to return. She didn't need a dramatic reunion. What she had, finally, was peace. And peace was love, too. Some betrayals don't come with shouting. They come with silence, with signatures already prepared, with love turned procedural. Celine's story wasn't about revenge. It was about remembering her worth before anyone else reminded her. She walked away, not to punish, but to protect what was left of her, moral lessons. Silence can be louder than violence when it's used to erase someone. Staying is not strength if it costs your identity. Peace doesn't always come from winning the fight, but from walking away with your dignity. Not all who leave are broken. Some are finally whole. Love without presence is strategy, and strategy isn't intimacy. You don't need drama to reclaim your life. You just need clarity and the courage to choose yourself. Which part of Celine's journey echoed your own? Was it the quiet heartbreak, the calm exit, the bold return to self? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Let someone else feel seen today. Like this story if it moved you. Share it with a friend who needs to hear this. And subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories for more narratives that leave impact, not noise. Because some stories whisper, and those are the ones that stay.